In support of Helen, how ancient artifacts help to show how Helen of Troy has been misrepresented in rhetorical study, presented by Nisha Hermiller. Primary source objects have major relevance for today's scholars of rhetoric and students. They are original first-hand pieces that represent a culture. They help us to relate more personally to the past. They promote a deeper understanding of history, and they encourage higher order thinking. For students, they're like taking snippets, pieces of a puzzle, creating a mystery that students can try to explore further by finding new pieces of evidence and through analysis. I'll start by introducing the artifact that will kind of be our focus of our presentation. This is an amphora depicting the judgment of Paris and the recovery of Helen. It's from the Greek late Archaic period, which was about 510 to 500 BCE. It's from Greece, Attica, Athens region, and is an example of ceramic black figure pottery. The artist is unknown, and it is currently displayed at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. An amphora is an ancient Greek jar or vase with a large oval body, narrow, cylindrical neck, and two handles that rise almost to the level of the mouth. Let's talk a little bit more about these Greek amphoras. They were the most common ancient pottery shape, and though their size and form had many variations, they all had neck, handles, body, and feet for parts of the amphora. These were used in antiquity to storage many different things, including food and other items. Food such as wine, olive oil, and even dried cereal were carried in these amphoras, as well as non-food items like pitch and even the ashes of the deceased. These are an important survivor in the archaeological record because they provide so many clues about the cultures, the dates of sites, trade relations, and even just the everyday diet of ancient Greeks. There are two types. The plain were more likely for everyday use, to be carrying food and used, where the decorated were for display and decor. The two sides of our amphora, side A, the judgment of Paris, and side B, the recovery of Helen. We will focus in on each of these sides as we move forward. This is also a cool view of the rollout, where you get to see both sides and kind of a 360 view all at once. Red and black figure techniques were a really cool way that they made these vases. They did start similar by having the potter shape the vessel on the wheel, though some pieces were very sizable and needed to be made in sections. And then after hardening to a leather-like state, they would be added together using slip, which is a liquid form of clay, and then fired. The black figure painting was where the figural and ornamental motifs were added with a slip that turned black during firing, where the background stayed that clay or red color. And then red figure painting was the opposite, where the motifs stayed red colored and the background is filled with the slip that would turn black. This technique did gradually replace black figure technique because it was just easier to draw details than laboriously delineate them with incisions. And the specific shapes and or designs gave notes to specific uses, and the pictorial decorations did help and still do provide insights into many aspects of Athenian life, and they help to complement the texts that we have to help show us more about the archaic and classical periods. These are examples of amphoras that show the black figure versus the red figure techniques so that you can kind of see the difference in the details. And our amphora follows this red figure amphora technique. So let's talk a little bit about Helen of Troy, who's the focus of our amphora and our presentation today. Helen is a major figure in rhetoric and literature and art. We see her depictions in every century and every generation and every style. She is a figure that's name is still known today and is the focus of the war, the Great Trojan War. That's the story told in the Iliad, an epic poem by ancient Greek poet Homer, where he recounts some significant events of the final weeks of the Trojan War. The piece was written in the mid-8th century BCE and is usually considered to be the earliest work in the whole Western literary tradition, and it is a well-known and loved story. Helen is said to be the daughter of Zeus, the god, and Leda, who was a mortal queen of Sparta. She's widely known as the most beautiful woman in the world. She was even stolen by Theseus, a Greek hero known for his slaying of the Minotaur, as a young girl and had to be rescued by her brothers. She had many suitors all over Greece, including the famed Greek hero Odysseus, though Helen would ultimately marry Menelaus, making him the future king of Sparta. The Judgment of Paris is a catalyst event for the Trojan War, though the story does not appear until the final book of the Iliad. The legend goes that Paris is a young shepherd boy and is chosen by Zeus to judge which of the three goddesses, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite, was the most beautiful. Hermes is sent there as a mediator of the judgment. Each goddess offered him a bribe to choose him. The bribes went along with what the goddesses were known for. So Hera bribed him with power, Athena offered to make him a strong fighter, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, of course, chose Aphrodite and her gift of Helen. Side A of our Amphora showcases this judgment of Paris. It's depicting the judgment showing Hermes, along with a dog who's often portrayed with Hermes. And he's leading Hera holding her scepter, Athena fully armed, and Aphrodite in her flowing robes. So this side of our Amphora really does a good job of detailing this event. Well, there's one little problem with Aphrodite's gift to Paris and the entire judgment of Paris. Helen was already married. She's not even in the beginning of her own story. She has nothing to do with the decisions that will haunt her and her legacy through literature and through life. The Trojan War is a war between the Greeks and the Trojans. It's dated by Greek authors to the 12th or 13th century BCE, and though it's celebrated in the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, it's also found in other lost early works and has inspired even writers today. Helen's husband Menelaus had turned to his brother Agamemnon, a conquering king and leader of the Greek forces, to help him recover his wife and make Troy pay for Paris's theft. This is just a nice little timeline of Helen's appearance in some major pieces of literature and rhetoric. It's important to note that the Trojan War is estimated to have happened around 1194 to 1184 BC, and many scholars do agree that there was some type of war over the city or around the city of Troy that ended in its demise. It's important to note, though, here that it's over 400 years later before Homer's Iliad is written, and each piece is 100 or more years later, which means that Helen's story really is one that is depicted based on the time period in which it's told, is built and grows through each of these pieces. And though many of them are very early ancient works, they still are hundreds of years apart from the events of the Trojan War. Helen's history in the Iliad, she's only mentioned 6 times, and most of those mentions remind us that she is longing for her home. Though it's important to note that Iris brings her to watch her 2 husbands fight and puts the longing for her heart in her heart for Menelaus, which then carries through to each of her meetings where she's longing to be home. She regrets leaving her family, and she regrets the entire war and her part in it. By the end, she is mourning Hector's death, and we finally get to hear about the judgment of Paris in her 6th and final appearance in the last book of the Iliad. History tells Helen's history throughout other works as well, though it often portrays her either as a kind, innocent victim or kind of a vixen who enjoys the world in which she has created this terrible thing, that she either doesn't understand what she's created because she's such a shallow, airheaded flirt, or that she is kind of the metaphor for beauty and lust. The Trojan War did last an epic 10 years and ended with the Greeks' famous Trojan horse, leading to a victory for the Greeks and the recovery of Helen. Most texts agree that Menelaus recovers Helen after the capture of Troy, and many say that the couple return to Sparta and remain happily married. However, many of the visual depictions make her recovery appear a bit less than loving. Our side B of our Amphora showcases a pretty uh, serious recovery of Helen. It is showing Menelaus walking. He's turning back and seizing a veiled Helen by the edge of her himation, which is just her cover that she's wrapped in. And he has this threatening sword kind of poking at her. There's also another warrior, potentially Agamemnon, who has spear drawn. And it seems as though she is being kind of forcefully returned home, and less of this joyous, loving reunion that may be an added note for the modern day romance or romantic that wants Helen to have a happily ever after. We're going to talk a little bit more about Helen, but this time kind of in defense of how she's portrayed so often in rhetoric. It's important to note that we know very little about Helen. Her story is really told in fragments and pieces and by other people. We don't hear much from Helen herself, and each new piece of writing kind of puts their own spin. It's also important to note that the custom of Helen's time would be that her marriage to Menelaus was arranged, so it's very likely that she may not have had a love story with him. However, it's also important to note that Aphrodite is said to have kind of whispered in Helen's ear and helped Paris to seduce her, maybe even tricking her or causing her to forget her own family. She's often depicted as being stolen forcefully by Paris and regretting and hating it, being with him. Also, this is a war, which means there were probably bigger politics to play between the Greeks and Troy than Helen would ever have anything to do with. Helen is very much treated as an object. After Paris's death, she's married off to his brother. She's then forcefully returned to Menelaus. There are other pieces of literature that show her marrying as many as 11 different men in her lifetime. And it's really hard to say whether Helen really had anything to say or anything to do with any part of her story, or if she was just a piece that was being played with, both literally in her real story and then in the literature and rhetoric that followed. Helen is in almost every piece of writing or art portrayed one of two ways. She's either a passive damsel or a selfish whore. It's as though because she is sexually active, because she is beautiful and known for her looks, she must be damned. When she's portrayed as the damsel, her fate is out of her hands. She has an inability to resist love and the temptation. She is just an object who really can't think for herself. Or in other portrayals, she's a whore. She's a vixen. She flutters her eyes. She rouges her cheeks. She is pulling Paris up into her arms and into infidelity. She is actively engaged and even tempting Paris. It's important to note that ancient Greeks, like future cultures, really linked bad character to beauty. This started with Pandora, where Zeus created this beautiful evil. Therefore, Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, as Ruby Blondell explains, was in her very nature the most destructive. Helen most likely had very little say in her own fate, and her story has never been fully told, certainly not by her. She was a pawn, not only in the war games of men and gods of her time, but history and rhetoric have set her up as a scapegoat and an ominous warning to other women. Beauty equals death and destruction. Helen is neither a vixen nor a maiden. Sadly, Helen is simply an ancient tragedy. She's one of the first, but certainly not the last, to be a side note in her own story and the scapegoat for the ambitions of men. Our amphora has rhetorical significance because not only does it showcase Greek culture and traditions, but it visually depicts critical aspects of the Trojan War and, more importantly, of Helen's story. Our Amphora helps to support the idea that Helen had little control over the start of her story and her relationship with Paris, and over the end of her story and her recovery by Menelaus. This Amphora, and many others like it, are just another piece of the ancient puzzle. There is so little left from this time period that we must use what is available. Artifacts like these can help students to see history and to dig into the past in ways that they never have before. Viewing different portrayals of Helen can give major insight into the cultural attitudes towards women and beauty of the time, which is the foundation of much of the writing about her, and arguably about many strong sexual women of history that followed. Thank you so much for attending my presentation, and I encourage you to visit the University of Findlay's Masters of Rhetoric and Writing page for more great content. Thank you.